When my grandfather died, he left my cousin the beach house. The one with the wraparound porch, the one families rent out every summer for $2,000 a week. Everyone at the funeral already knew it was coming. My cousin cried the prettiest tears I'd ever seen. Me? I got the storage unit. Not a building. Not property. A 10 by 20, climate-controlled storage unit at the edge of town, registered under a business name I'd never heard of, with 3 months of prepaid rent left on the contract. My husband didn't say anything in the car on the way home. He didn't have to. I could feel it coming off him like heat. My name is Iris. I'm 31 years old, and until 8 months ago, I thought the worst thing my husband ever did to me was forget our anniversary 2 years in a row. I was wrong. We'd been married for 6 years. We met when I was 24, and he was finishing his MBA, and everything about him felt like direction, like someone who knew exactly where he was going. I admired that. I still do, in the cold, specific way you can admire a quality in someone you no longer trust. His name is Connor. I'll say it once, and then I'll just call him my husband. Because that's what he was, and that's the part that matters to this story. We didn't have children yet. We'd been trying for 2 years, which was its own quiet grief we carried separately. I worked as an office manager for a dental practice. He consulted for mid-sized companies going through restructuring. He made more money than me. He reminded me of this, not cruelly, not directly, but in the way he'd pause before agreeing to vacations, or sigh when I mentioned wanting to take a ceramics class, or mention offhandedly that his colleague's wife had just gotten her real estate license. I thought that was just marriage, the low-grade friction of 2 people trying to merge their ideas of a future. I know better now. When my grandfather passed, I flew home alone. Connor said he had a client presentation he couldn't reschedule. My cousin was already there when I arrived, already talking to the estate attorney, already smiling in that particular way. She smiles when she thinks she's already won something. Her name is Portia. She's 2 years older than me, and she's always been the one the family pointed to when they wanted to say, "Look what's possible." Her husband is an orthodontist. They have a house that photographs well. She sends Christmas cards. The will reading was the next afternoon. My aunt and uncle were there, 2 of my grandfather's old friends, and the attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Fitch who kept his glasses on the end of his nose and read everything in the same flat, careful tone, regardless of what the words actually meant. When he got to Portia's name, she reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. The oceanside property at 14 Creel Road, including the structure and all furnishings, will transfer to Portia. Her husband kissed her temple. My aunt dabbed her eyes. Then Mr. Fitch continued. The contents and remaining lease of storage unit 114 at Hargrove Self-Storage on Route 9 will transfer to Iris. Nobody laughed out loud. That's the thing about families. They've had years of practice keeping it behind their teeth. My aunt said, "Oh, how thoughtful," which meant nothing. My cousin made a soft sound that wasn't quite sympathy. Her husband looked at the window. I nodded like it made sense. I folded my copy of the will into my purse. I thanked Mr. Fitch. I drove back to my aunt's house where I was staying, and I sat in the guest room for a long time without turning on the light. That night, Connor called. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Portia got the beach house. And you?" "A storage unit." Silence. He didn't ask where it was or what might be in it or whether I was okay. He asked, after a moment, whether I'd looked into what the beach house was currently renting for. I said I hadn't. He told me. I don't know how he already knew, but he did. $2,200 a week in season, he said. That's over $30,000 a summer, Iris. I know, I said. He went quiet again, and I could hear him thinking, recalculating, doing whatever it is he did when the numbers didn't add up in his favor. Your grandfather never really saw potential in you, he said finally. I don't mean that to be harsh. It's just the truth. I didn't respond. That was the first time he said it with words. Before that, it had always been implication, suggestion, the shape of a thought he'd never quite finished out loud. I got home 2 days later. The house felt the same. He was watching something on the couch, and he didn't get up when I came in. We didn't talk about the storage unit again for a week. Then one night, I mentioned I wanted to drive out and see what was inside. He looked up from his phone. "Why?" he said. "It's probably old furniture, or boxes of junk he never threw out. It's still mine," I said. He made a small sound, the kind that means technically. He didn't offer to come with me. I drove out on a Saturday morning in October. Route 9 runs along the edge of the county, past the grain co-op and the old drive-in lot and a stretch of commercial lots that had been half developed and then stalled out. I'd driven this road 100 times growing up. I'd never paid attention to it. Hargrove Self-Storage was a low, flat, complex orange and white, the kind of place that looks the same in every town. The manager gave me a padlock key and a code for the gate and pointed me down the third row. Unit 114 was at the end. The padlock opened on the first try. I pulled up the metal door and stood there in the morning light. It wasn't furniture. It wasn't junk. It was files. Dozens of them, stacked in bankers' boxes, each one labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. There was a card table set up in the middle, folded chairs leaning against the wall, a standing lamp plugged into an outlet near the floor. Like someone had been working here, recently. I stood in the doorway for a long time. My grandfather's name was Arthur. He'd been a quiet man, a practical man, the kind who fixed things himself and never explained his reasoning until it was already done. He'd worked in land surveying for 30 years before he retired. I knew that. Everyone knew that. What I didn't know, what I hadn't thought to ask, was whether he'd ever stopped. I started with the box closest to the table. Inside were property maps, survey documents, township records going back 20 years, some of them stamped, some annotated in red pen. None of it made immediate sense to me. I wasn't a surveyor. I didn't know how to read the measurements or what the boundary notations meant, but I kept going. The second box had correspondence, letters from a county planning office, letters from a regional infrastructure department, one from something called the Eastern Corridor Development Authority dated 14 months ago. I sat down on one of the folding chairs and started reading. The language was careful and bureaucratic, but the meaning, once I slowed down enough, was not complicated. There was a rail expansion project, a freight line that had been dormant for 40 years, running through the eastern part of the county, was being reactivated. The corridor would be modernized. Distribution centers were expected to follow. The county had already begun rezoning parcels along the route. I found a map in the third box. It was a survey of a land parcel 12 acres, and along one edge of it ran a thick black line, the corridor. I looked at the ownership notation in the corner. The parcel was registered to a LLC. The LLC's registered agent was Arthur Kimball, my grandfather. I sat very still. I went through 4 more boxes before I found the letter I think he wanted me to find. It was in an envelope tucked inside a manila folder labeled simply Iris, and I don't know how I missed it the first time, except that my hands were shaking a little and I wasn't reading carefully. The letter was short. My grandfather never used 2 words when one would do. "Iris, if you're reading this, you found the key." Good. That means you came yourself instead of sending someone. The parcel on Alderman Road is 12 acres. The rail project will break ground within the year. I've had 3 offers in the last 18 months and I turned them all down. I kept waiting for the right time, and then I ran out of time. The LLC transfers to you with this letter. Instruction sheet is in the red folder. Call Warren Kessler at Meridian Land Group. He's been patient. You were always the one who paid attention to the quiet things. That's why this belongs to you. Grandpa, I read it twice. Then I put it face down on the card table and pressed both hands flat against it like I needed to feel that it was real. I stayed in that storage unit for 2 hours. I went through every box. I made notes in my phone. I took photographs of the key documents. By the time I locked up and drove back down Route 9, I knew 3 things. The parcel had been appraised at 4 times what my cousin's beach house was worth. The rail corridor made it eligible for commercial rezoning. And the most recent offer, the one my grandfather had declined 11 months ago, had been from a logistics company preparing for exactly this expansion. I didn't tell my husband that night. Or the next day. Or the week after that. I called Warren Kessler on a Tuesday morning from the parking lot of the dental practice, sitting in my car with the heat on. He answered on the second ring. When I said my grandfather's name, he went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I was wondering when you'd call." He explained the situation in straightforward terms. The rail project had officially broken ground 6 weeks ago. 2 distribution companies had already announced sites within the corridor. The parcel my grandfather owned sat at what would become, within 18 months, a primary access point for the northern section of the development. The interest had not gone away. It had grown. He used the word significant twice. The second time he said it, I wrote the number down in my phone because I didn't trust myself to remember it correctly. I drove home that evening and made dinner and sat across from my husband while he talked about a client in Ohio, and I nodded at the right moments and I kept my face completely still. I had spent 6 years learning to disappear in this marriage, to take up less space, have smaller opinions, want cheaper things. I'd done it so gradually that I'd stopped noticing. I thought it was compromise. I thought it was what you did. But sitting across from him that night, knowing what I knew, I felt something shift. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter. Something that had been waiting. 3 weeks later, he came home in a bad mood. A deal had fallen through. He was short with me over dinner, and then shorter when I asked if he wanted to talk about it, and then, when I mentioned that I'd been spending time looking into the storage unit contents, he put his fork down. "What is there to look into?" he said. "It's a land parcel," I said. My grandfather owned land. He looked at me. "How much land?" 12 acres, I said. He calculated something silently. "Where?" "Route 9 corridor." He didn't know what that meant. Not yet. I watched him decide it wasn't worth knowing. "Old farmland," he said. "That whole stretch is industrial wasteland. It's being rezoned," I said. He picked his fork back up. "Rezoned for what?" he said, like he was humoring me. "Commercial. The rail project," he chewed. Set his fork down again. "The rail project is a county pipe dream. They've been talking about that for 15 years. It broke ground 6 weeks ago," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "How do you know that?" "Not is that true." "Not really." "How do you know that, like the problem was my having information he didn't?" "I looked it up," I said. He was quiet for the rest of dinner. That night, in bed, he asked me who owned the parcel. I told him it was in an LLC that transferred to me through the will. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "We should talk to someone, an attorney, to make sure it's structured correctly. For both of us." I said, I knew what "for both of us" meant. I had already spoken to an attorney, not about the land. About something else. I had made that appointment 3 weeks ago, quietly, on a Tuesday, from the parking lot of the dental practice. I won't pretend I had a plan from the beginning. I didn't. I was just paying attention, finally, after years of not paying enough. The following month, I drove out to meet with Warren Kessler in person. His office was in the county seat, a 3rd-floor walk-up above a title company. He was in his 60s, unhurried, the kind of person who had been around long enough to find nothing surprising. He spread the maps out on his conference table and walked me through everything. 2 offers had come in since my grandfather's death. Both were serious. One was from the logistics company that had contacted my grandfather. The other was from a regional developer who was assembling parcels along the corridor. The numbers were different from each other, but neither of them was small. He slid a folder toward me. "I'm not going to tell you what to decide," he said. "But I'll tell you that the window for negotiating from a position of strength is probably the next 90 days. After that, once they've locked in adjacent parcels, your leverage decreases." I asked him what he would do. He thought about it. "Your grandfather held out because he wanted to choose the right buyer, not just the highest offer. I'd honor that." I drove home on Route 9. I passed the storage facility. I passed the turnoff for Alderman Road, a gravel lane I'd driven past my whole childhood without a second thought. I passed the old drive-in lot. When I got home, my husband's car was in the driveway. He was in the kitchen with a woman I recognized as a colleague of his. They were looking at something on his laptop. He introduced us. She smiled with her whole face, and I smiled back, and I went upstairs to change my clothes. I will not dramatize what I understood in that moment. I'll just say that some things you know before you know them, and that by the time the knowledge arrives in full, you are already prepared. I filed for divorce on a Thursday in November. I had not told him about the offers. I had not told him about Warren and Kessler. I had not told him about the family except my mother, who had kept it quietly, in the way she's always kept things she needed to protect. My attorney made sure the LLC was properly documented as separate inherited property before any proceedings began. That had been the first thing I'd asked about in that Tuesday parking lot phone call months before. Inheritance is yours, she'd said. It does not become marital property simply by existing during a marriage. As long as you haven't commingled the funds or titled it jointly, it's protected. I had not commingled anything. My grandfather had made sure of that. The divorce was not a scene. There was no confrontation, no dramatic moment at a restaurant, no folder pushed across a table. That's not how it happened for me. It was papers. It was conversations behind closed doors with attorneys. It was dividing 6 years of furniture and accounts with the kind of exhausted care that makes you grieve the time more than the person. He asked, at one point during mediation, about the land. My attorney spoke before I did. The parcel was inherited property, she said. It falls outside marital assets. He looked at me then, not with anger, with something more specific than anger. I looked back at him calmly and I thought about my grandfather sitting in a folding chair in a storage unit at the end of Route 9, writing letters, turning down offers, waiting for the right time, waiting for the try come and find it. I accepted an offer in January. Not the highest number, but the buyer my grandfather would have chosen. Warren said so himself. A regional development group with a clean record of community agreements, not a company that would build a concrete box and leave. I kept a small retained interest in the development agreement. Warren suggested it. Your grandfather always kept a piece of things, he said. Said it kept him honest about what he was participating in. I thought about that for a long time. Portia called the week the deal closed. She'd heard there's someone, I don't know who. Her voice was careful. I heard you settled the land situation, she said. I did, I said. That's great, she said. A pause. The beach house needs a new roof, by the way. $12,000. The rental income barely covers carrying costs. Oh, I said. I'm sorry to hear that. She made a small sound. Dad always thought Grandpa was harder on him about money, she said. I guess Grandpa just had different ideas about different people. I looked out the window at the backyard where the November grass had gone gray and flat. I think he just paid attention, I said. She didn't say anything to that. I live alone now, in an apartment in town that gets good light in the mornings. I'm taking a ceramics class on Wednesday evenings. I told my instructor I have no natural ability, and she said that wasn't the point, and I've been thinking about that ever since. My mother came to visit last month. We drove out on Route 9 and I showed her where the parcel was. There's construction equipment visible now from the road and a sign with the development company's name on it. She didn't say much. She just looked. Then she said, "He always said you were the one who came back to check on things." I asked her what she meant. "When you were small," she said, "he'd take you out on surveys with him. You were the only grandchild who wanted to go. You'd sit in the truck and look out the window at the fields and ask him why the lines mattered." "I don't remember that," I said. She smiled. "He did," she said. I drove home on Route 9 as the sun went down. The construction site was still lit up. Yellow lights in the early dark. Cranes parked for the evening but present, solid, real. My grandfather didn't give me the smallest piece. He gave me the one that took patience. And the night my husband told me, without quite saying it, that I wasn't enough, he thought that was the end of something. He was wrong. It was the beginning. I've thought a lot about what my grandfather understood that the rest of us didn't. He watched people his whole life. 30 years of walking land, measuring boundaries, marking where things began and ended. I think that kind of work changes how you see people too. You start to notice who looks at the ground and who looks past it. Who stays when something isn't obviously valuable? Who comes back to check on the quiet things? Connor never came back to check on anything. That was the truth I kept not saying out loud for 6 years. He was drawn to the obvious, the number that was already high, the asset that was already visible, the person who was already succeeding. He didn't have patience for potential. He didn't trust what he couldn't immediately quantify. And somewhere along the way, I had let that become my measuring stick for myself. That's the part that took me longest to reckon with. Not what he said about me, but how long I'd been half agreeing with him. When I drove out to that storage unit on Route 9, I wasn't expecting anything. I went because it was mine, and because even if it turned out to be nothing, I wanted to know. That's such a small thing, just wanting to know. But I think it's where everything started. Not with the land survey maps or the LLC paperwork or Warren's phone number. It started with deciding that something was worth looking at even when no one else thought so. My grandfather bet on that quality in me. He turned down 3 serious offers over 18 months because he was waiting, not for the market, for me to show up and open the door myself. That still gets to me when I think about it too long. He had more faith in my curiosity than I did. There's a version of the story where I don't go to the storage unit, where I let Connor's voice in my head, the sighing, the calculating, the quiet implication that I wasn't quite enough, convince me there was nothing worth finding. I almost lived that version. I almost called the facility to ask about surrendering the lease. I'm grateful I didn't. What I learned, slowly, over those months between finding the letter and signing the final papers, is that integrity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest about what you actually see, even when the people around you have decided it's not worth seeing. My grandfather had that. He looked at 12 acres of scrubland along a dormant rail corridor, and he didn't see what it was. He saw what it was becoming, and he had enough patience, enough confidence in his own reading of things, to wait. I'm still learning that patience. The ceramics class is evidence of that. I'm genuinely bad at it, and I keep going, which is new for me. I used to quit things before I could be seen failing at them. Now I figure that's where most of the learning actually happens. Portia's beach house needs a new roof. The rental income barely covers costs. I don't say this to be unkind to her. I say it because it's a reminder that the obvious prize isn't always the real one, and that sometimes the person who hands you something that looks like nothing is the person who thought about you the most carefully. My grandfather didn't give me a consolation. He gave me a test, and the fact that I passed it, that I drove out there alone on a Saturday morning in October just because it was mine, is something I'll carry longer than the money.